It's a privilege and honor to have him give this lecture. And it's a chance for me to tell him how grateful I am for his presence at Cornell and how much I've learned from him and how generous he has been in certain times coming to NEH seminars and other events, other programs that I've been involved in. And I would also like to say that Jonathan's contribution to the intellectual community at Cornell can hardly be measured. He's not only meant a great deal to me, but to a great many of his colleagues and the college and the university.
Professor Schwartz, I think you muted yourself.
Said everyone had been muted.
Nobody heard me at all?
No.
We just missed the last like 5 seconds, maybe.
Did you hear me thank Jonathan at the beginning?
Yes.
Okay, so where did you, what was the last thing I left off on?
Just the thank you.
I thank Jonathan for how much he meant to me. Did you hear that?
Yes.
Yes. All right, so the Jonathan Culler, is that where we dropped off? All right, okay, Jonathan Culler, I don't know what happened there. Is class of 1916 professor of English and comparative literature, Emeritus at Cornell University. A 1966 graduate of Harvard, he won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, where he took a B.Phil in comparative literature and a D.Phil in modern languages. He was fellow in French at Selwyn College, Cambridge, then university lecturer and fellow in French at Brasenose College, where actually I spent a little bit of time. Then he moved to Cornell in 1977. In 1982, 82, he succeeded Mike Abrams as class of 1916 professor of English. An expert on French and English literature and literary theory, Culler is the author of Flaubert, The Uses of Uncertainty, and numerous books on contemporary critical theory, Structuralist Poetics, winner of MLA's 1976 Lowell Prize, Ferdinand de Saussure, 1976, The Pursuit of Signs, Semiotics, Literature, and then Deconstruction, Non-Deconstruction, 1982, Roland Barthes, 1983, Framing the Sign, Criticism in His Institutions, 1988, and he's also this very popular book, Literary Theory, A Very Short Introduction. His most recent book, and one from which I've learned a great deal, is The Theory of Lyric, 2015. Jonathan is really the person more than anybody else who brought literary theory to these shores, and has been an extraordinarily important influence on the intellectual community in the humanities in this country as well as throughout the world. He's been president of the American Comparative Literature Association and the Semiotic Society of America. And he's also served as the chair of the New York Council for the Humanities, and he's been elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, the American Philosophical Society, and the British Academy. It gives me great pleasure, and it is a personal honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Jonathan Culler.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that extremely generous introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to deliver the Phi Beta Kappa lecture here. I guess before I start, let me just ask people to, if they are not already muted, if they mute their microphones. That way we won't hear dogs barking and telephones ringing during the course of the lecture. It would have been nice to do this in person, but we're now all growing accustomed to this Zoom system, and I hope it will work well. So this afternoon, I want to talk about some issues in literary theory that directly concern the relation between assumptions in the academic study of literature and those with which other readers may approach novels and poems. So it's become something of an article of faith in the academic study of novels that every narrative has a narrator, explicit or implicit, separate from the author, and identifying narrators and their point of view has really become a staple of literary education. But in the case of poetry, we find something that seems rather analogous. Ever since the new criticism of the mid-20th century, it's become widely accepted that every poem has a speaker other than the poet. And pedagogical handbooks tell students that the first question to ask when approaching a poem is, who is speaking in what situation? Now, both of these theoretical assumptions seem to me contestable as general principles. I used to say, well, there are definitely narratives with narrators and poems with speakers. It's scarcely evident that every narrative necessarily has a narrator, or that every poem a speaker, separate from the author. But I'm also interested in the relationship between these two cases, and whether do they illuminate one another, and how do they relate to each other. So let me take up first the question of the narrator in prose fiction. So the idea of a narrator distinct from the author seems to have been invented seems to have been developed in the beginning of the early 19th century in order to characterize novels where the narrating character is different from the author, as in Sterne's Tristram Shandy is narrated not by Sterne, but by Tristram. So let me share screen here, and sorry, not clicking on, there we go. Okay. There we go, okay. So my colleague Sylvie Patron has shown that seems to be the first mention of the narrator separate from the author as a distinct concept. In Letitia Barbo's introduction to the correspondence of Samuel Richardson, she writes that there are three modes of carrying on a story. First is the narrative or epic, as it may be called, where the author himself relates the whole adventure, as in Don Quixote or Tom Jones. It's the most common way. Another is that of memoirs, in which the subject of the adventures, that is a character, central character, relates his own story. And this mode confines the author's style, because the author should write in the discourse of what is suitable to the capacity, shall we say, of what this can be known, what might be said by such an imaginary narrator, is her phrase. And the third mode is the epistolary mode, where the letters of the characters convey the narrative. So in Barbo's scheme, what we today call third-person narration is conceived as related or presented by the author, and alternatively, the author can create an imaginary narrator, a character who to recount his or her own story. Now, the assumption that, in fact, all narratives, including third-person narratives, have a narrator separate from the author has only come about really in the late 20th century. Previously, narratives not in the first person were said to be related or even narrated by the author. So even Anglo-American New Criticism, which with its resistance to biographical criticism, initially treated fictional narratives without a first-person narrator as narrated by the author. So here, Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren, in their classic textbook, identify four types of narration. First two in the first person, and then the third and fourth are with the author as narrator, either author observer or omniscient author. But of course, an author who narrates is rather different, is a narrator in a rather different sense from a character narrator. After all, the author creates the story, stipulates what happens, whereas a character narrator does not stipulate, but characteristically reports the story as something that has already occurred. But it's really only with the development of narrative theory, narratology, and especially French structuralism in the late 20th century, that a model was developed, which we can now call pan-narrator theory, where every narrative must have a narrator, whether visible or invisible. So we basically have these two possible models, what I'll call the optional narrator theory, where there are two possibilities: first-person narration, where the author invents a narrator, and an authorial presentation. This is in Barbeau, and this for many theorists prior to the mid-20th century. This was the assumption. Russian formalists had this view of the narrator, and then model B is what I'm calling classic narrative theory, narratology, or we can call it pan-narrator theory. The author invents a narrative world and necessarily invents a fictional narrator who is part of this world, knows it, and tells the story to a fictional audience, a narrative audience, as something known. And that fictional narrator may say I, as in first-person narrator, or may not. May not appear as a character, shall we say. The two models that I'm going to be contrasting here. Now, in the case of poetry, especially lyric poetry, the introduction of the ubiquitous speaker occurs earlier in Anglo-American criticism, as American New Criticism, here we go, yes, treats the poem as an artifact and dramatic structure rather than the discourse of the poet, and made it a principle to distinguish the speaker of the poem from a poet. So here in 1938, John Crowe Ransom is laying down the law. Poet does not speak in his own, but in an assumed character, etc. And the first thing we do is to determine what character and what situation are assumed. And from there, it's only a small leap for Ransom to conclude, rather extraordinarily, that the poem may be said to be a dramatic monologue, that Browning only literalized the thing that had always been the poem's lawful form. I mean, that's really, Browning popularized the dramatic monologue. My Last Duchess is the most famous, I guess, with an identifiable speaker character speaking in a particular situation. The idea that all lyrics have a fictional speaker means that, in effect, the dramatic monologue went from being a new development in the late 19th century, an exception in the realm of lyric poetry, to being the norm. But it's really quite extraordinary for Ransom to claim that this is really the only lawful form of poetry, that we had not realized that until Browning came along and produced the dramatic monologue. Anyway. In the Anglo-Saxon world, this principle, not necessarily elsewhere, but this principle has become really the foundation for pedagogy of the lyric. A classic textbook, Sound and Sense by the Lawrence Perrine, now in its, long ago, now in its 14th edition, tells students, here we go, that to aid us in understanding of a poem, we ask ourselves a number of questions. The two of the most important are: who is the speaker and what is the occasion? And since poems belong to the world of fiction, people should assume that the speaker is always someone other than the poet. And finally, the textbook concludes that we may think of every poem as the utterance, not of the person who wrote it, but of a fictional character in a particular situation that may be inferred. Now in both cases, both the case of fiction, narrative fiction, and the lyric, there is a desire clearly here to deter biographical criticism, to focus on the words themselves, etc., in the text itself, and making the author not responsible for statements in the text by separating author from narrator and speaker. From narrator or speaker in the case of the lyric. Though I think that the concept of fiction in itself, ought by itself to suffice to protect the author from being held responsible. But of course, the move of attributing the discourse to a narrator or to a speaker does rather more than that. By turning attention away from the author, it deflects attention from the work as a thing made, as a product of artistic decisions, and it focuses attention instead on a supposed person who, except in special cases, is not a writer, and whose choices therefore need to be explained in other than artistic terms. So the problems here become especially evident, I think, when we consider the case of lyric poetry. Many poems clearly have no speaker. Here's, for example, E. Cummings' famous Grasshopper poem, where the letters of jumbled letters of grasshopper sort of leap down the page and become grasshopper. No one speaks. The author arranged the letters and the words in this weird way, which we can decipher that the grasshopper, the muddled grasshopper, who, as we look up now, gathering into a leap, arriving to become rearrangingly grasshopper, as it were. But so it doesn't make, so to ask who is speaking and in what situation makes no sense. It's a composition of the author, right? But consider now one less extreme case, for example, William Carlos Williams' famous red wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain, water, beside the white chickens. So here, if we ask the pedagogical question, who is speaking, that leads us into rather fruitless speculation. Is it a gardener? Is it a farmer? Is it an aesthete who's gushing at, oh, look, a red wheelbarrow, how wonderful, etc. And why would someone say this? What is the situation? But to try to imagine who speaks sets us on the wrong track. I mean, there are a couple of major problems. First, it distracts us from, sets aside the central question of why the poet wrote the poem in this way. And even if we reach a hypothesis about the speaker and decide it's a gardener who loves his wheelbarrow, that would tell us nothing about the effect of the arrangement of words on a page, which is obviously the result of decisions by a poet. But more important, if we decide that it's spoken by, say, a gardener who loves his wheelbarrow, that trivializes the poem because it becomes the opinion of a strange individual rather than a mysterious declaration that is invested with authority by the poetic form and ultimately by the authority of the author. So be happy to talk more about this example later if you like. Or take a case where it's easy, where we almost need to imagine a speaker, where we are seriously tempted to do so. Dylan Thomas's Villanelle, do not go gentle into that good night. Villanelle is a poem in which, well, as you will see, the two lines, do not go gentle into that good night, and then the third line, rage, rage against the dying of the light, are repeated in a fixed, according to a fixed scheme throughout the poem. I've left out a stanza here, which otherwise it wouldn't have fit on the page very easily. But the final stanza addresses you, my father, there on that sad height, curse, bless me now, with his fierce tears, I pray. So this certainly invites readers to imagine a speaker addressing his father, perhaps a dying father, rather than a poet writing these lines. But if we posit a speaker, then all sorts of irrelevant questions arise. If we say, who is speaking? Well, it's the man sitting beside his dying father. That's the situation. He's urging his father to, hold on now, don't die on me. Then the question arises, why does he say the same thing over and over again? Do not go gentle into that good night, do not go, etc. Is his father deaf? Or what's the significance of this sort of hectoring behavior, which scarcely seems a good bedside manner for a son of a dying father? So those pedagogical questions really distract us from the poem and get us involved in some weird and irrelevant speculations. The most striking features of the poem, its formal structures, are clearly the work of a poet, not of a speaker. And in fact, in the case of lyric poetry, we could venture a general rule of thumb that the greater the effects of repetition and oral patterning, that is alliteration, assonance, rhyme, rhythm, etc., the less mimesis of voice, the less it is the imitation of someone speaking. Most of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poems, for example, what we have is compelling verbal phonetic play, but not a speaker. Here's Inversnade. One quatrain omitted again, I'll get it comfortably on the slide. This darksome burn, horseback brown, his roll rock, high road roaring down, and Cupid and comb, the fleece of his foam flutes, and lo to the lake falls home, etc. It goes on from there. If we try to imagine a speaker here, we can certainly conceive of someone looking at a mountain stream, that's a burn, mountain stream, but it's hard to imagine someone who would choose these words. I mean, why would anyone but a poet select just these particular words? And it's especially weird to suppose that the speaker chooses just these words, but does not know that they're arranged in this rollicking 4-beat rhythm. A wind puff, bonnet of fawn, froth turns and twindles over, etc. And that every 4th beat rhymes, for example. We could say that the speaker contemplates and celebrates the brook and expresses the hope that such wild natural beauty may be preserved, but it's scarcely clear what would be gained by imagining a speaker who is not a poet speaking these words with no appreciation of the intense vocal play that we readers experience. I mean, isn't it much better to say that the poet, rather than some speaker, has chosen these particular words arranged in this way in order to create this experience, and that it's the poet who is celebrating the wild beauty here evoked in this sort of exuberant, harmonious exuberance? I mean, if we prefer, we can always say it's the implied author. Fine, that's fine. But the fiction of a speaker who is not an author really serves no purpose and introduces all sorts of extraneous considerations. I mean, if we ask, who is speaking, then would we need to ask, what sort of pretentious person would look at a brook and say, and coop and comb the fleece of his foam, flutes, etc. It's weird, really taking us away from the poem. Okay, but let me now come back to the example of narrative. The claim that every narrative must have a narrator is often presented really without argument, as if the narrator were a logical entailment. So here's a couple of examples. By definition, a narrative must have a narrator. A story must have a storyteller. Many analysts take face-to-face narration as the norm or point of departure, somebody telling somebody else that something happened, and then extrapolate from that to build a general account of narrative. But in fact, this does not seem to me a compelling argument, and there's slippage in the move from storyteller to narrator. And if a child asks me to tell her a story, the story of Little Red Riding Hood, I'm the storyteller, right? But suppose I say that she's old enough to read it for herself and I hand her the book. Does that mean that suddenly the story acquires a narrator that it didn't have before if I'm just telling it? And the philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff asks, here we go, yes, why can't the novelist just straightforwardly tell us a tale of love and death? Why must it always be a tale of a narration of love and death? He's been reading narrative theory and knows that every narrative is supposed to have a narrator. So there's always a narration of love and death. In fact, no one need be conceived as uttering the words of a story. The words tell the story when they're read. But it really was the attempt to devise a formal account of narrative in general that led to the separating of author from narrator in third person as well as first person narratives, and taking all narratives as a communication between a narrator and a narrative audience. But as I say, I think it's hard to defend this as a general model. When we consider nonfiction narrative, for example, say a biography or historical narrative, we don't claim generally that there must be a narrator separate from the author. We can distinguish different authorial attitudes or strategies. The author decides what sort of role to play, what sort of stance to adopt. Is he distant, objective, intimately acquainted with the thoughts of the actors, satirical, exuberant, etc., reverent? So, for example, this is probably too ancient an example, but from the students. But there's a considerable difference between the posture of Tom Wolfe's *The Right Stuff*, which is a celebration of the and the courage and dedication of the hotshot astronauts, the sort of Tom Cruise, hotshot pilots, the sort of Tom Cruise types who go on to become astronauts. And a contrast between that and Wolfe's snarky book Radical Chic, which centers on makes fun of Leonard Bernstein giving a party for his friends on the Upper East Side, Upper West Side, as a fundraiser for the Black Panthers back in the day. So both books have the lively writing that's made the author famous, but very different attitudes towards the subjects. But we don't feel any need to say that he has invented two separate narrators to tell these stories. We don't ask what does each narrator know, etc. He just writes them differently. So why then should the fact that a narrative is imagined rather than researched require an extra level of mediation? In fact, I mean, there are many fiction, it's obvious that there are many fictional narratives that dispense with narrators, and this creates no problems. Comic strips are an obvious case. Nobody has ever asked, I think, who is the narrator of Peanuts and what is the situation of the narrator of Peanuts? The thoughts, speech, and actions of the characters are simply represented. Or again, think of film. Film narratives are created and presented. We can certainly say this film tells a story, but except very rarely in films with voiceover narration or that are with a single character, a character narrator. So we would not say that films have a narrator who tells a story. We generally, in most films, have no sense that there is a person, a narrator who inhabits the world of the fiction and who has observed the scenes represented and is now showing them to us. We attribute the selection of what's being shown and how it's shown to the director or to the whole production team. I mean, what we have is a fictional simulation of events or presentation of events. Some of these events may be events as imagined by a character in the story, but in general, as Seymour Chapman notes, the structure of film is to present things as a visual record of what happened out there. The idea of a narrator for film, most films, seems quite superfluous. The organizing agency, as I say, is the team that produced it. So I think it's certainly possible to reject the notion that fictional narratives necessarily require a narrator. Some do have one, some have one, and some do not. Sorry, I keep clicking the wrong thing to get ahead. So a frequent argument for the structure, for the ubiquitous narrator, is that the author of a non-fictional narrative asserts what he knows, and that narrative fiction is a fictional imitation of non-fictional narrative, sort of an account of the world of the fiction by somebody in that world to whom that world is known, right? So in fiction, then the narrator is standing in for the author or the teller of the non-fictional narrative, as Margolin in the second quote claims in the narrative living handbook of narratology. As someone for whom the world is real and for who is not imagined and therefore whom can make assertions about that world and events in it. But there's several problems with this model. First, if we take the novel as a fictional imitation of a real world speech act, that immediately raises the question of what sort of act it can be. The authors of non-fictional narratives, biographers, historians, etc., write texts for readers to read, to consult. But are we supposed to imagine that the narrators of novels are writing a text for an audience? Sometimes in first-person narrative, that's the case. I'm sitting here trying to write the story of my life, etc. But usually critics, in third-person narratives, critics speak as if narrators are actually telling the stories. But is someone supposed to be speaking for hours on end and to what sort of audience, etc.? Of course, I mean, we ignore such questions quite correctly. They're irrelevant questions, but they're the logical consequence of this theoretical framework that we have adopted. And to adopt a theoretical framework of necessary narrator, it requires us then to ignore the questions of what kind of act is this narration, how and when is it taking place, where and to whom, etc. As opposed to adopt that framework that poses all these problems that we then have to ignore, as opposed to the simpler framework of an author offering us a written story, seems perverse, certainly a violation of Occam's razor, principle of Occam's razor. But if the Pan Narrator novel supplies a narrator in order to furnish for third-person narratives a person who inhabits this world and who knows the world, then a second problem immediately arises. When narrators are posited for third-person narratives, they characteristically do not behave like persons. And that was supposed to be the whole rationale of why we needed a person, a narrator, a person there to report, who would report things as known, could make assertions about this world. But for instance, they recount things that a person could not know, such as the thoughts of characters in the fiction, or what happens on occasions where there's no observer present. So these supposed narrators seem to be rather fantastical persons. Yet, as the philosopher Kendall Walton points out, In realist novels, the fictional world does not include such a person with powers of omniscience. That is to say, it's not fictionally true that there is one person, the narrator, in this world who has superpowers. That would make it into a sort of science fiction story. So bringing in a narrator in order to make what is told something known really creates a problem, precisely the problem that it was supposed to solve. In fact, to explain the presentation of thoughts of characters, happenings that no one observed, and so on, one needs to have recourse to the author who stipulates these details. And further, third problem, if the narrator is posited in order to make what is recounted into something known, a third problem emerges. If we suppose that there is a narrator who knows intimately this fictional world, the thoughts and doings of its characters, etc., then the question arises of why the narrator tells us some things and not others. Sort of every possible detail not recounted is something this supposed person has chosen not to relate. And since the narrator is supposed specifically not the author who would make these choices for artistic reasons to achieve particular artistic effects, we have to find some other reasons for the narrator's choices. Now, and here the analogy with lyric poetry is suggestive, I think, sort of helps to clarify the situation. In the case of the dramatic monologue, My Last Duchess, or Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, the convention is that the speaker chooses the words he uses, and we can talk about why the Dukes in the My Last Duchess says this or that, etc. Why does he choose these words? What's he trying to accomplish? But the convention is he does that, but he does not know that he's speaking verse. We have this division of labor. Right? The poet supplies the verse. So when we imagine a speaker for lyrics that do not contain first-person speakers, we confront a situation where the alleged speaker, not a poet, is deemed to select the words of the poem, but not the properties of those words, rhythmical, phonological, etc., that make them poetically effective, as in the case of Hopkins and Thomas, which becomes less plausible. With a dramatic monologue, very plausible. We're having a poetic rendition of a fictional speech act by a person which was supposedly not a speech act in verse. Right? But the reason for the choices of words, therefore, are not supposed to be poetic ones. We allow this sort of division of labor in the case of the dramatic monologue. In fiction, the pan-narrative theory would give us a similar division of labor, rather odd one, that the author is responsible for determining everything that happens in the novel, including what characters think, what they wear, what they say, etc. But then there's a narrator, covert or overt, who's deemed to choose what to reveal to us, whether or not to reveal this information, whether to describe the clothes, the thoughts, and so on, and exactly in what terms to do this. To describe narrative point of view, of course, is characteristically to describe those choices and to attribute them to a narrator, not to the novelist. The reasons for those choices are not supposed to be those of the novelist. So just to take a brief example, in Ernest Hemingway's The Killers, here's the beginning of the story, a famous story. If we posit a narrator and ask what the narrator knows, we might first say that he or she knows what a local observer sitting in the diner would know. He's sitting in the diner and two men come in, he doesn't know who they are, etc. But such an observer, and we get the conversation going, but such an observer, as we go a little further in, could not know what George sees back in the kitchen, where one of the killers has tied up Nick Adams and Sam the cook, and wouldn't know what transpires in Ole Anderson's room when Nick later goes to warn him that there are two killers who have two people who have come looking for him, planning to kill him. To solve this problem, critics are sometimes led, and very extravagantly, to see this as an omniscient narrator who just chooses not to tell us much. And that's an unusual solution, but it seems to me sort of a logical one for someone who believes that every narrative has a narrator. That how do you explain the things that the narrator tells us and the things that the narrator does not tell us? So Barbara Olson argues, for instance, that though The Killers is often cited as the very model of limited sort of camera eye narrative, it actually features Hemingway's omniscient narrator at his most reticent. that he could tell all but prefers not to. So the critic would then need to explain why the omniscient narrator declines to tell us all sorts of relevant things that he or she must know, including the past histories of these two killers and why they're setting out to kill the Swede and so on. Imagining motivations for that narrator's refusal is sort of a strange business, because such choices are properly explained as choices made by the author for artistic reasons, and not as some sort of psychologically motivated decisions of a narrator who's telling a story that he has, what he's seen from inhabiting this world. Decisions about crafting a text, not selections of which bits of prior knowledge to relate. So if we posit a narrator here, not only do we deflect attention from the artistic choices by transforming them into decisions of an imagined narrator, to whose psychology we really have no access and about which we can only speculate, but we immediately confront, of course, major problems of consistency. Is the narrator a local person sitting in the diner who manages to somehow avoid being noticed by the killers, but then how does he or she know these other things that are related, etc.? So focusing on an author, on the other hand, those problems do not arise. We can imagine that the author provides this narrowed vision to give us the experience of a certain helplessness in a potentially sinister situation, along with a certain amount of information to allow us to understand the scope of what is happening. Well, this is an extreme case, but it perfectly illustrates, I think, how treating the story as something known to a narrator creates unnecessary problems. As in the case of poetry, we do better to ask how the text is written rather than who speaks in what situation and how this person happens to know the things that he or she is telling us. The work of a pioneering American narratologist, Seymour Chapman, can help us to see briefly and by way of conclusion what's at stake here. In his classic Story and Discourse, Narrative Structure in Fiction and Film, he argued that the author decides whether to have a narrator, whether there should be a narrator. And when there is a narrator, it's a demonstrable, recognizable entity immanent in the narrative itself. A narrative that does not give a sense of this presence is maybe reasonably called non-narrated or unnarrated. So a simple example would be a story that takes place entirely in dialogue, for example, not narrated. In this book, Chapman devotes an entire chapter to non-narrated stories before moving on to covert and overt narrators. So this then is clearly a version of what I'm calling optional narrator theory. The narrator is only when there's explicit manifestation of someone recounting a story. Right? Now, but in a later book, where we go, Coming to Terms, Rhetoric of Narrative in Film and Fiction, Chapman recants this view, apparently in order to provide and to go along with the general structuralist attempt to provide a general model for all narratives. And every narrative, he argues, is presented by a general narrator. By definition, every narrative is by definition narrated. And that narrative presentation entails an agent even when the agent bears no signs of human personality. So even though this supposed narrative role may sometimes be totally limited to showing, as he says, if we do not redefine narrator to include presenting, we have no way of accounting in general narratological terms for performed stories, movies, plays, mime shows, and the like, comic strips, etc. That is to say, he takes it for granted that we need a general model, for narratives, for all narratives, which includes a narrator, even though then what is called the narrator functions very differently in a play, much less a mime show, and in a novel with first-person narration. So this, in the shift between Chapman's two, especially in the second book, we can see the cost of reinstating the narrator for every narrative, that for stories with no overt narratorial presence, that it's a very high cost, and illustrates the difficulties of pan-narrator theory. So the category of narrator then in this second book becomes rather vacuous. In film and third-person narrative, what Chapman now calls a narrator is not somebody telling a story whose decisions about how to present it, what to say, we should examine as reflecting a particular point of view. Rather, this non-human narrative agency, as he says here, communicates yes, communicates non-human narrative agency. There we go. Sorry, communicates all and only what the implied author provides. So all the decisions are made by the author. And what this new vacuous narrator does is simply, in the cases that were previously called non-narrated, are purely formal agents who present details chosen by the author or by the implied author. There's no question of attributing to these narrators human decisions about what to present or what ways to present it. So there's no point in talking about narrative point of view with these narrators. They have no real purpose except to justify this general model for all narratives, which then have to be divided into two classes, depending on whether the alleged narrator has any function or not. And Chapman, to give him credit, rightly objects here to speaking about what a non-personified narrator knows, since what he does is simply present the discourse or transmit images or discourse to the reader. It's a discourse agent, he says, whose capacity to render this or that detail of the story depends not upon knowledge, but on how much the implied author has delegated to him, her, it to present. So such non-human narrators are stripped of the functions usually attributed to narrators. And it's not clear why introduce such an unneeded narrator. In fact, this later version of his account, of Chapman's account, ought to provide support for optional narrator theory, since it actually identifies these two cases and the differences between them, reasons for not treating such purely formal narrators in the way that we treat narrators in first-person narration. But it still promotes confusion by retaining the term narrator in both cases, though Chapman admits in the one case, it could just as well be presenter. For those who find narrator awkward, in the case of these purely formal agents, presenter, he writes, is a good alternative. Then why does pan-narrator theory still hold sway given its disadvantages? I mean, it's had a pretty good run for 40 years or so. And there are doubtless several reasons. First, it absolves, as I said, it absolves the author of responsibility for statements, judgments, etc. in the narrative. But for statements about characters and their doings, this is accomplished by the notion of fiction. I mean, we don't really need an addition to assert a narrator in between the author and the text. The author invites readers to imagine these characters, these events. And for some statements, though, claims about our world and not specifically about the world of the novel, a narrator really doesn't solve the problem, since the narrator's alleged knowledge is of the fictional world of the narrative, which for him is real. So insofar as the statements, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina famously begins, all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own fashion. Well, I take it this is not supposed to be simply a statement about the fictional world of Anna Karenina. The claim is that this is a general observation about our world, not just about the world of Anna Karenina. So it needs to come from an author or an implied author, and not just the fictional narrator. But I think a much more important reason for the success of the principle of ubiquity of narrators is no doubt that it helps distinguish sophisticated students and critics from ordinary readers who ordinary readers take third-person narratives to be narrated by the author. So the framework of the necessary narrator is thought to give us, to represent a cultural acquisition, really? Knowledge of how literature really functions, and we're, of course, probably reluctant to give up such special knowledge. It helps to suggest that literary studies is a real discipline. While ordinary readers think that Jane Austen is telling the story of Elizabeth Bennet, those who've been taught to say, no, it's the narrator who tells the story, display what passes for superior understanding of how fiction works. Related, and I think more powerful factor is that pan-narrator theory has seemed pedagogically useful, that it gives students something to do in identifying narrators in the narrative position. Whether this is really worthwhile or not is a different question. But we instruct students they must overcome the idea that this is the discourse of Jane Austen or George Eliot, and work to identify the narrator. What does this covert narrator know? What are his or her values, etc. So when Pride and Prejudice tells us that Mr. Bennet was so odd, a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 3 and 20 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Students can tell that such an assertion implies a narrator with thorough knowledge of the characters and their history, so not just of their present affairs, someone who really knows them well and is intimate with their world. And since identifying narrative perspectives has become central to literary education, we're reluctant to renounce these skills, which sort of are fairly recently invented. But really, this is make work. Its virtue, of course, is it encourages a certain amount of close reading. But well, essentially, students are taking what the text affirms, what is stipulated by the author, and then saying this is what the narrator knows, and they feel that they have accomplished something. But maybe it's I think misdirected as becomes obvious when we dispense with the necessity of a narrator. We don't have to ask what someone knows or doesn't know, much less how he or she comes to know it, because the supposed knowledge is just whatever the author wrote. The text imagines us asks us to imagine this to be the situation of Mr. and Mr. Bennett. So no, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, no need to invent somebody to assert it. And here the analogy of poetry is helpful. We don't need to invent someone other than the author to say so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. And that will, in fact, as I mentioned, sort of trivialize the poem and deflect our attention from what we should be thinking about. So in the case of both lyric poetry and narrative fiction, the assumption that we must explain assertions in literature by finding or inventing somebody, not the author, who's responsible for them, leads to a range of fruitless or inappropriate steps. Fortunately, critics ignore the implications of the theoretical frameworks they accept. They don't usually spend a lot of time asking how, who is actually speaking and what the narrator actually knows, etc. They allow themselves to discuss the artistic reasons for authors' choices instead of speculating about what might have led a fictional speaker or an imaginary narrator to produce the sentences offered by their texts. But instead of a situation where good criticism needs to ignore the problems created by the theoretical frameworks it accepts for lyrics or for narrative fiction, we need to work to get our frameworks to avoid creating problems and to describe the nature of literary situations more perspicaciously. So in short, there's still considerable scope for optional narrator theory as it comes back into its own after a hiatus of some years to refine and improve the character of our engagement with and our teaching of literature. And it has the added advantage of reducing the gap between what critics assert and what other readers experience when reading poems and novels. Thank you very much. So, one thing about Zoom is we miss the applause, right? We can applaud for ourselves here. That's it. Somebody, Dan, etc. So we're going to have some discussion now. This is the general model, and here's a little bibliography if somebody wants any references for, or you can always email me and I'll send you plenty of things to read. So
thank you so much, Professor Culler, for the wonderful lecture. So are you happy to open up for questions now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So if everyone could just raise their hand and then I will unmute you.
Hi, thank you for this talk, Jonathan. A lot to think about here. I guess I don't necessarily agree that fiction can or should separate authors from responsibility from their words, and I don't think recognizing that an author or narrator are non-identical achieves that as well. I think it's kind of a porous ontological boundary. But I wanted to ask a question that's more focused, and in particular on the speakers within poetry and with repetition. And I'm pulling from Julia Miele Rodas's book, Autistic Disturbances here, because I think neurodivergence gives us a very interesting lens to look at poetics. I think E.E. Cummings' Grasshopper could potentially have been written by a dyslexic person. Rodas has a section on repetition as well. And she writes that next to silence, verbal repetition is without a doubt the most noticed and most commented on feature of autistic language, often given the pathologizing word echolalia. She goes on to say, autistic repetition offers all the joyous potential of Lego building blocks. Why build detention centers given autism's poetic proclivity, quoting Ralph Savarese? People use repeating forms and components to compose villanelles. These kinds of repetitions aren't necessarily non-human. It's just that they're not recognized as such. And I want us to be careful with that, because she says that just as the idea of autistic silence suggests emptiness, so too repetitive language invites a similar interpretive gestures. The autist echoes because she is hollow, nothing inside. She has no self, no point of origin. Since the words are all form and no substance, their expressive value is effaced. I think that these are things to consider, but then also how these poetics can sort of be used to reclaim agency. She actually cites you here as a way to sort of recover autistic info dumping as a form of apostrophe. So I guess just a few things to consider here.
No, I think, I mean, I'm certainly, I'm just saying that if we take seriously the notion that each poem is supposed to be spoken by, I'm not muted, okay. Each poem is supposed to be spoken by a speaker other than the poet, and that it treated as an imitation of a non-fictional speech act. It could lead us into all sorts of rather irrelevant questions, which is not to say that there are not speech acts that do involve a certain amount of repetition, but it's certainly the repetition. We don't want to have to start saying, well, any poem in which there's a lot of repetition is the representation of an autistic speaker or something of that sort. The function of repetition in poems tends to be ritualistic. There are other kinds of motivations. It's not simply that it's not, I won't say simply, but it's not that it's a product of a certain kind of mental situation or mental condition. I think even if it might have been true that the poet who produced it had such a condition and was therefore led to produce, if Cummings had been dyslexic and produced these poems, still, I think we don't want to read it as, oh, just this is the product of a dyslexic person. It's a clever organization that we are supposed to sort of decipher and enjoy deciphering. So yeah, I'm certainly not I'm far from wanting to devalue repetition. I simply want to point out that it's not something that's generally accounted for by the hypothesis of a speaker who is not a poet, that this is repetition that's produced for poetic reasons. Okay.
Thank you.
Jonathan, could I ask, is it possible that speaker in some ways is a misnomer? The idea that there's, sort of a speaker holding forth, within the lyric space orally. I'm thinking about this more, I think, from a poet's perspective, and what sorts of permissions the concept of a speaker or an authorial projection might deliver for the poet themselves. For me, when I write poems, it's not so much about evading responsibility for what I put on the page or something like that, but it is about sort of what slice of myself I decide to sort of turn towards the listener or the you across that lyric space. So, in my lived life, I don't normally walk around speaking in quatrains either. No. And so there is some distance still, right, between the author. And so I tend to think of speakers, if we couldn't call it that, along a continuum, right? And I tend to think about just how proximal are they sort of that authorial self, or what part of the authorial self is being sort of refracted through the speaker or the projection.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a very plausible relationship. That's very similar to what I was saying about non-fictional narrative. That it's the case of example of Tom Wolfe, that authors authors of biographies or histories take different approaches to these in their different books. So there's, in a sense, a different persona, but we don't feel that we have to say, oh, each of these is the product of has a different narrator. We hold the author responsible for what is said in these books, and authors want to be held responsible for what they are saying for the most part. And I think a lot of, especially with lyric poetry, there's many poems are poems which authors want to be responsible for the words and for the effects of their words, rather than just say it. So this is what my fictional persona would say, partly because that does tend to trivialize the poem if you're just creating a fictional person who says something weird, as opposed to something that you are investing in as a version of yourself or a part of yourself. So yeah, I think the notion of voice and the notion of a speaker. I remember when I was an undergraduate, I was being taught by people who were new critics, which was a minority view at Harvard at that point. So we felt we were very special. We knew what was going on. But the thing that always bugged me in these, with my one tutor, and especially, she always would ask me about the tone of this poem. What is the tone of voice? And I was really supposed to, with poems by Donne and Herbert, etc., I was supposed to imagine a speaker and what would be the tone in which you would speak if you were saying these words, which is very sort of difficult to reconstruct. It was usually there was a fairly understandable range of possible tones about irony and things like that, but it seemed a strange view, as opposed to a strange way of making sense of the poem by always having to imagine a sort of fictional speaker. For lots of 20th century poems, of course, this doesn't work. The poets are not necessarily they're not trying to. You may have the imagining a voice, a version of yourself, but even without going as far as E.E. Cummings, there are lots of concrete poetry or other poems that are where the spatial disposition on the page is the crucial thing, and it's hard. They're not really a representation of anybody speaking, and the way in which many 20th century poets read their poems suggests that no, they're not really meant as a representation of somebody speaking. They're very clearly not reciting it, they're saying they're reading it. You have the piece of paper in front of them and it's being read as if it were almost as if it were prose, or at least words on the page. Anyway, but yes, I think your version of that is your version of your poetic practice is certainly a good account, and we can fit that in the relations between author and implied author, shall we say.
When I teach those poems, the concrete poems and the visual ones, one of the immediate problems is how to voice it, and the ways that those poems sort of refuse the oral performance. I do wonder if there's still possibly, one could argue, a kind of mattering that happens, through an authorial body in that instance. But
yeah, no, for me, there's a very important distinction between voice, the idea of a voice, sort of empirical person's voice, and voicing, the oral activity. As with the Hopkins poem, you don't want to say, it's a poem full of voicing. When Coupin and Combe, the fleece of his foam flutes, and low to the lake falls home, and wind puffed bonnet of fawn froth, etc. But it's not the voice of a person, shall we say, who's chosen to say these things while standing in front of a waterfall. But yes, that is a problem for a lot of concrete poetry. I mean, the Cummings, how would you voice the Cummings? I tried to do it at one point, but I couldn't figure out what to do. It's hard to pronounce those combinations of the grasshopper word. Yeah. Okay.
I see a hand up here. Mrs. Lowenberg, Ina. Emily, can we unmute Ina Lowenberg?
Right. Okay. It seems to me that necessarily separating the poet in lyric poetry, the poet from whoever is speaking, really stands the whole problem on its head. with much lyric poetry when it is written in the first person, and to take our most recent Nobel laureate Louise Gluck, with her poems, it's very tempting to see them as confessional, and it is a project of criticism to see whether perhaps they are not confessional but are something else. So I think that this is somehow looking at this from the wrong end of the telescope,
Well,
at least with lyric poetry.
yeah. And of course, with poems in the wild iris that are spoken by flowers, you do very clearly have a speaker that is not the poet. But one can certainly, you can certainly start from the other end and say, presume that poems are spoken by the author unless you can demonstrate otherwise. That hasn't been the strategy in the pedagogy of lyric in recent years anyway, to do that. It's been the opposite really, as in those pedagogical, basically from the late 40s to the present, most of the even, someone like Helen Dunner is a wonderful case. Her textbook, Poems, Poets, Poetry, which is an excellent textbook, still tells the students the first thing to do is to ask who's speaking in what situation. But she herself, when writing about some of these poems pedagogically, she doesn't spend time trying to wondering who is actually speaking. She talks very sensibly about what the poems are doing, and so it's a case of a critic who doesn't necessarily follow her own pedagogical instructions when it comes to doing criticism, because she's an outstanding critic as well as a wonderful pedagogue.
Why don't we do one more question, okay? Who wants to ask the last question?
You can have as many as you want. I don't know how many hands there are there.
There are quite a few hands. We have about 5 or 6 people whose hands are raised still.
I'm happy to do some more questions if you like, Dan.
All right. Why don't we seal it, say, at 5:04? It's 5:34. Around about 10 more minutes, Jonathan.
Sure, that's fine.
Then we'll adjourn with the students for another. Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Okay, I'm gonna start.
Whose hand is up? Whose hand is up? It's hard to tell. Can you see all of them? I can't.
Yes, I'm asking people to speak.
Can you see everyone?
Yeah, we're able to.
All right, so why not call on someone with a hand up? Why don't we do 10 more minutes of questions? So let's try to keep them brief and okay, and so we can move along. Okay, Susan
make
Wolfson.
the answers brief. I can try to make the answers brief, but yeah, go ahead, someone.
Brian, I allowed you to speak.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hi. I'm basically with you on this. But there's one argument that doesn't seem persuasive, which is when you say interpolating a narrator means that we give up our capacity to talk about aesthetic choices, because the aesthetic choices are author's choices, and the narrator is a sort of a naturalization, and he doesn't make aesthetic choices, or she doesn't make. But I don't see that follows, right? Narrators make aesthetic choices in the real world. Everyday conversational narratives are based partly on the aesthetic choices of narrators. So I don't know why interpolating a narrator makes it impossible to talk about choices.
It doesn't make it impossible. It's just partly that we, you're in principle, with the Killers, for example, no, I've not seen anyone who suggests that the person in that there is a narrator who is in the diner who is a skilled storyteller and who is making good aesthetic choices. The talk is all about this narrator only sees these things and not those things, etc. So you're just further away from the aesthetic choices made by the author, insofar as the distinction between the skilled writer, whose craft you want to appreciate, and a supposed narrator who has selected bits of information to give you. But yes, it doesn't prevent that. It just gives you different kinds of reasons for you don't immediately ask why you don't immediately have the same repertoire of possibilities. You're very much using face-to-face ordinary conversational narrative as the norm in terms of which to explain the narrative. So Brian was my first PhD student many years ago, back in Oxford. It's always nice to see you, Brian. He's become a distinguished narratologist since then.
Thanks.
All right.
Why don't we have you go next?
Thank you so much. Professor, I twice noticed that you use narrator and narrative positioning kind of reciprocally. I wonder if they're the same, because so with the narrator, we kind of imagine her as a comprehensive person with this kind of ethnical responsibility, but I feel like we can still say, and I don't know, like the implied author speaks from a certain position. And I wonder if we can say like all narratives have narrative positioning, even though they don't necessarily have narrators. Thank you so much.
Yes, no, that's certainly possible. There's, I know, any of these, you know, with the Hemingway short story, for example, one wants to talk about the narrative positioning. I think one of the virtues of talking about narrative positioning as opposed to narrators is that if you think of the narrator as in principle a person with limits, kinds of limits that usually apply to real persons about what they can know, what they can see, etc. They can't look through walls, can't look inside people's heads. Then you can describe more carefully the various things that would be inconsistencies in terms of a person. That if people, you know, in the Killers, you have this presentation of what's happening in the diner with only the knowledge that a local person would have. That the local person, the narrative says that a motorman entered, so somebody he's being recognized as someone who drives a tram, etc. But not knowing anything about the killers themselves. So, but then you have these other details that are given about what happened when Nick went to the Swede to tell him about the danger he was running, where no one else is there, and so a person who is a narrator couldn't know that. But it's very effective within the story itself. And if we talk about narrative positions, yes, then we are much better placed than if we try to think about who is the narrator and what is the narrator's situation.
Okay, perfect. Can we have Aileen go next?
Yeah, hi. Thanks. That's just a fascinating discussion. I'm coming from a point of view where, so I'm a writer, I write both fiction and nonfiction, and I've been teaching in graduate MFA programs for 30, 40 years. And almost all of what we talk about in terms of craft has to do with who the narrator is, right? And in a very complex way, you know, but from the point of view of people who are actually grappling with the writing of the text. And some of the most interesting discussions we have and the most interesting works being written today, it's really interesting to ask who the narrator is as opposed to the author. So in nonfiction, you know, when you're talking about Woolf putting on different personae, that's, you know, it's a very complicated process to come up with who am I when I'm writing this essay or piece of memoir or work about, you know, the astronauts. You know, when you're working in third person, here's the third person narrator, but now that narrator is slipped into the character's consciousness, so the thoughts are going to be inflected by that character's way of talking, and the speech is subtly different. James Wood wrote a wonderful chapter on that. So, you know, we're not naively thinking of the narrator as necessarily a person, you know, with a narrative occasion, although that sometimes happens. But it seems to me, especially since so many of the young writers are people of color, they're queering the text, they're challenging the notion of who was this omniscient narrator to begin with? Was it God? Was it some, you know, all-knowing white educated person? And so a former student of mine, Britt Bennett, used an omniscient narrator who really were the chorus of the church ladies who seemed to know everything about the character. So in other words, it seems to me one of the most interesting ways of looking at text being produced now is in this way of who is this narrator as opposed to an author, as opposed to the characters. And it seems that you're wanting to, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, to drop the narrator out of it at just the moment when it's most productive to be asking, you know, who is the narrator becoming in these new texts, and how is that working? You know, how does it work in fiction versus nonfiction or autofiction? Wouldn't you want people to be thinking more about who these narrators are, as the writers are consciously thinking about who their narrators are in this sophisticated way, rather than dropping them out of the discussion, you know, rather than trying to simplify it at this point?
Yeah, I'm tempted to come at this. I resist the notion of omniscient narration, just because that seems to me to group together a whole variety of different strategies, as you, as a fiction writer, would know. You do all kinds of different things, whether it's it's an authorial narrator who just stipulates that something's going to happen and makes it self-consciously does that, or whether it's sort of the church ladies chorus, or the the George Eliot, you know, sort of we historians, etc., who is very extremely knowledgeable, but supposed nevertheless not to be omniscient, because it wouldn't, these judgments are supposed to be worth something and not coming from God. So I think it's very striking that there's been, despite that in recent fiction, as you say, what people sometimes call omniscience is coming back. But there are all sorts of different versions of this so-called omniscience, and I think it's important to try to describe those narrative postures and the narrative techniques. I think you're right that you need to get away from the idea of that. Okay, my narrator is a person who knows these things, and because then you get all sorts of contradictions and inconsistencies that the writers want to use, don't want to abandon, and say, oh, I have to make this. My narrator can't say that because this narrator wouldn't know that sort of thing. So yes, I think avoiding the assumption that there is a narrator, that a person-like narrator, and thinking about the narrative strategies that the author deploys is very, very central. But you're right to talk about the variety of possibilities that are there now.
I think we're going to close the meeting now and thank Jonathan, and everybody can applaud quietly, because he's been terrific, and one of the great lectures in our series. And the students, we're going to say goodbye to you guys. We're going to hold on the same site and we're going to have a little, Jonathan's going to meet with some of the students at a make-believe dinner that we usually have after these lectures. So we're going to have and I invited a few of my students. So thanks so much for coming. We had a wonderful attendance, and I know Jonathan is as pleased as I am that this was such a wonderful.
I just say that that's now scrolling down up and down the list of attendees. I see lots of friends and acquaintances, and I would like to just say hi to them. And I'm sorry we are not seeing each other in person anymore. But yes, thanks for providing this occasion, Dan. And actually doing it by Zoom probably gave us a wider variety of attendees than gathering in Hollis Cornell probably would have done.
You had a wonderful attendance. I watched, and people went. The max was at over 160, and that's a very, very good attendance. So thank you, Jonathan, again. It was wonderful. So, and thank you. Some of these people are my friends too, and my former students, and I'm saying hello to them also. And hello, Susan Lancer. Okay, and Beth Newman. Okay, bye-bye. And the students will stay.
Okay.
All right, we'll have a minute of transition here.
A minute of transition as people.
You had a wonderful crowd. That was great.
Yeah,
some of those people, my people, your people, it was good.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Culler, for speaking. This was such an amazing talk. We had people calling in, I know across the country. We had a few people calling in from the Pacific time zone, a few people who were requesting the recording of the talk from Australia and New Zealand, somebody's in South Africa, right? So I guess this is the upside of Zoom. We get people from all over the globe.
That's right. And Billy, I mean, this is true even for small talks, Jonathan. People are coming, even if I gave a talk on campus last week, and people pop in from all over the place. It's kind of fun. You know, your old graduate students that you haven't seen for years.
Professor Schwartz, so, do you continue to record, or should I stop recording now?
That's a good question. I think we should stop recording.
Okay, perfect. Let me do that.
I want to, Sukami and I, by the way, is in South Africa. And